All right. Well, we are going to wrap up our sermon series on Upside Down. We're done with the Beatitudes themselves, and so we're going to follow up with the next 2 or 3 verses in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to finish it up today, and next week unravel it. Our first reading from the Hebrew Bible is from Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13. You shall not omit from your grain offerings the salt of the covenant of your God. With all of your offerings you shall offer salt. And then our New Testament reading is Matthew 5:13. Jesus is speaking. This follows immediately after the final 8th and final beatitude on persecution. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but it is thrown out and trampled underfoot. The word of the Lord. Y'all are the salt of the earth. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was a Texan, although that might explain his colorful language. But rather, I am saying that the "you" in Matthew 5:13 is plural. If we were from New Jersey, Jerry, we would say what? Not y'all, but yous, right? Yous are the salt of the earth. Either way, it's significant because it shows that Jesus isn't just talking to individual Christians here. He is talking to the whole community of faith, the church. All of us together are the salt of the earth. Now, I'm going to talk about the function of salt in a little bit, but we want to pause here to remind ourselves that whatever it is that we are called to do as Christians in the world, we are called to do together in community, not alone in isolation. There is simply no way that anyone, no matter how spiritual they may or may not be, can live out the countercultural values in the Beatitudes in isolation. Can't be done. The world is simply too aggressive for us to be meek by ourselves. The world is too cruel for us to be merciful on our own. The world is too corrupt for us to be pure without other people alongside of us who are seeking to be pure. The world is too violent for us to be peacemakers without others who are in relationship with the Prince of Peace. Can't be done. We need one another desperately. And that's why worship, that's why being part of a community of faith, especially a growing, learning community of faith, is so important. So if you're not in one of those 3 small groups that are in the bulletin, I would encourage you to consider getting yourself into one of those groups this fall. And parents, remember next week Sunday school restarts. Little hearts, little ones, they need communities of support and encouragement also if they're going to live out their Christian faith. All right, enough of that. We are the salt of the earth. So let's think about salt. Now, salt is pretty cheap today, isn't it, right? You can go to Hy-Vee, you can buy a pound of salt for maybe 50 cents, something like that. But it hasn't always been like that. Salt in the ancient world was really expensive. It was really valuable. Covenants, for instance, were always sealed with salt to show your commitment to the agreement. So Leviticus chapter 2:13, which I read, says that all sacrifices in Israel had to include salt. That showed that the worshiper meant business, because he or she was sacrificing something that was valuable and important. Same thing in Greek culture. Greek aristocrats, for instance, would often pay for their slaves with salt. If the slave didn't meet the buyer's expectations, that slave was said to not be worth their salt. A phrase which has survived into our very culture today. We see the value of salt in Roman culture also, where a soldier's pay would include an allotment of salt. This allowance or allotment was called a salarium, from which we get our English words for salary or sale. So you're getting the point here. Salt was really valuable stuff in the ancient world. And so when Jesus says that we are the salt of the world, of the earth, the first thing he's saying is that we are valuable. Valuable especially to God. Not just for what we do, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for who we are, His beloved children. You know, all of our sophisticated theology, and we Presbyterians love our sophisticated theology, all of that sophisticated theology is great and wonderful, and I love it, and I'm going to continue to preach it, but every once in a while we need to pause and come down off of our highfalutin, ladders and just say this to one another, and that is that each and every one of us is loved by God. God loves you. Just as you are, not for what you do, God loves you. You are infinitely valuable. Every human being is infinitely valuable to the Maker of the universe. So valuable, in fact, that God sent His only Son to live and to die and to come back from death so that we could experience life abundant. John 10:10, I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. The Greek word means overflowing. Each of us is loved just for who we are. Hang your hat on that, would you, today? But God also values us for what we do, what we're capable of doing. Salt in the ancient world was valuable for a reason. Long before freezers or refrigerators were invented, long before people were able to put their food in sealed containers, there was only one thing that kept food from spoiling, of course, and that was salt. Only salt stood between people and starvation during the winter months and during the dry season. Salt was and still is valuable because it preserves stuff. It prevents decay, and it prevents corruption from settling in, and thus it preserves life itself. That's the calling of the church also. You and I are called to prevent corruption from setting into the world. We are to infiltrate every layer of society in order to prevent them from going bad. Schools, businesses, civic organizations, media, and all social structures are in constant danger of corruption and eventual collapse unless you and I are in those institutions making God-pleasing decisions and doing God-pleasing works, being upright and honest and loving and caring and compassionate in all of those different social institutions. That's our job. And the stakes, I don't have to tell you, are high. Democracy, in fact, will cease to function if people cease to be good. I can't recall the exact quotation, but I heard it somewhere along the way, and it goes something like this. No government is so perfect that men, women, do not have to be good. No government can ever be so perfect that men and women do not have to be good, to be salt, and as we'll see next week, light in society is the essence of democracy, of keeping it alive. But what does this mean for everyday life? Well, first of all, it means that we need to get out of the salt shaker and into the world, as Rebecca Manley Pippert put in her famous book by the same title. We need to get out of the salt shaker, that is the church, right? You and I gathered here, and into the world. You see, the ironic thing about Christians is that sometimes we can be so involved in church that we never get out into the world where our saltiness is needed. I remember once encouraging a group of church members to invite their non-church friends to an upcoming worship event. The reply from the church members was telling. They said to me, well, all of my friends are either in this church or they all go to another church. Now, I get that, actually. I, in fact, completely understand that. As a pastor, it is really, really easy for me to isolate myself from non-Christians and unchurched members. I mean, after all, it kind of is my job description to hang out with church members. That's what y'all pay me for. Mostly, at least, right? So it's really easy for me to spend all of my time in the church, with people in the church. Now, that's one of the reasons that I'm so glad that we have our fitness ministry here at St. Paul. And one of the reasons that I'm so glad that I go and play pickleball here in our Family Activity Center. I have become friends through this with lots of people who have nothing to do with St. Paul and a number of people who have absolutely nothing to do with the church at all. But then I get up close and I rub shoulders with them and I sweat with them. And, we put ourselves into pressure every once in a while. They discover that, I'm kind of a nice guy. Okay, I don't curse a blue streak when things don't go my way. I don't throw my racket down and go, oh, I'm so angry. I don't do those things. And because of that, because I get to know people and I come to love them and care for them, we've actually had a couple people who have come and who have visited here because they've gotten to know me, they've gotten to know Annie Temple, they've gotten to know Mark Poland, or Mary Poland, and Bill Judge, and David Beecher, and Dean Neihart. And Dean now, of course, as you know, is like the pickleball champion of the world like that. And so he's like an ambassador to China and Singapore. I think that's where I don't know what Dean's watching this. I think that's where his next tournament is. But you get the idea. It's that experience that helps me to make connections. It's a place where I intentionally get outside of myself and meet people who aren't part of St. Paul. Now, sometimes we think, I don't know, Bill, I don't think people really would be very interested to meet me. Or they really wouldn't be very interested in faith. But my experience has been the exact opposite. People are really interested in faith. They're really turned off by Christians on the whole, but they're really, really interested in Jesus. So if we can go out there and if we can show them that people who love Jesus actually are really nice human beings, then they'll stand up. They'll take notice of that. But we've got to get out of the salt shaker and into the world, right? We've got to put ourselves in places where we rub shoulders with people who don't go to church on a regular basis. So here's the question today. What's your pickleball? What is your pickleball? Where's the place that you intentionally get outside of yourself and go hang out with people who don't go to church so that you can get to know them and love on them and share your faith with them? Is it maybe your kid's sports team? Is that your pickleball? Is that your place? Is it your neighborhood association? Is it the PTA in the school? Is it the Lions Club? I don't know. What is it for you? And And if you don't have one of those places where you're intentionally putting yourself in close proximity to people who don't go to church, then I would recommend that you prayerfully consider finding one. Find some place that you can go out and you can hang out with people who aren't involved in a faith community. Do that. That's your calling in life. It's important. But salt has at least one more function besides preserving food, and that is, as we talked about with our little ones, adding flavor, right? Salt brings saltiness, right? It brings out the flavor of otherwise dull and boring foods like popcorn and crackers. And this, too, is the church's calling in the world. The fact is, masses of people in our society are just plain bored with life. They're bored. Either they sit in front of their television, vicariously experiencing life through other people's existence, or they move from one life experience to another like a happy child, like a child at a smorgasbord. They say, I think I'll try a little yoga. Yes, give me some of that. Yes. And how about a super 4K high definition 65-inch television? I'll try some of that. Maybe I'll try some CBD oil too. Maybe I'll try some skydiving. Yes, that's what I would like to put on my plate. And although they may seem happy on the outside, especially the yoga and CBD people, inside, they're bored. They're bored out of their gourds. They're bored because a life centered upon self is a boring life. Jesus came to save people from themselves. He came that all people might have life and have it abundantly. Jesus is the spice of life. He's the picante sauce. He's the salsa. He's the paprika. He's the salt. He's the pepper. He's the good stuff in life. And he calls us to be the same kind of people. So the question is whether our faith, together and individually, but especially together, is it lively? Is there something vibrant about the way we live? Something different from the common person around you? Is our worship, for instance, truly exalted, truly joyful? Do we come here to church on Sunday morning truly expecting to meet the risen Christ? Or do we simply come here to punch our religious time clock? To just go through the motions. Holy, 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 merciful am I. Do we sing our hymns with energy? Or are we just going through the notes? How about our conversations with others? They too ought to be lively, full of the spice of life. We need to take time to listen and to care, to love others. And we need to be bold with our words also, to not be afraid of sharing what it is that Jesus has been to us in our lives. It's okay. People really are interested in Jesus. They're just not interested in hypocritical people. Our love of life, friends, should be contagious because the love of God is contagious. What's the campfire song? It only takes a spark, right, to get fire going. And so God made us to preserve and to spice up the world. But there's a warning in our Bible passage too. And that is that if we stop doing that, we aren't good for much for anything. If salt has lost its taste, says Jesus, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no good for anything, he says, except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot. Now, we know, of course, there's some chemist out there I know, who are saying, but Bill, Pastor Bill, Salt, sodium chloride, NaCl, it can never degrade, it can never lose its saltiness. And yes, indeed, you're correct, except salt in the ancient world was never pure NaCl, was never pure sodium chloride. It was always mixed with impurities, and when salt had too many impurities in it, it could indeed lose its taste. And when that happened, it was used on footpaths as gravel and as weed killer. Tasteless salt literally was thrown out and trampled underfoot. Jesus is using this vivid description, this warning, to describe what can happen to you and me and to the church. If we let the impurities of the world dilute our faith, we become useless to the Lord and useless to the world. We're no longer good for anything, and we're throwing out, and the church declines and eventually closes. Not all churches that close for that reason. Overall, that's the trend. But Jesus believes in us. He believes that we can stay faithful to our calling. Just listen in our text to the faith that Jesus has in us. He didn't say, you, disciples, are the salt of Jerusalem. Nor did he say, you're the salt of Palestine. And he didn't say, you're the salt of Johnston, Iowa. No, we could see all of those things as being possibilities, right? But he didn't say that. He said, you are the salt of what? Of the earth. Of the world. The whole doggone enchilada. You're the salt of all that stuff. What an outrageous claim. And yet a little is a lot when the Lord is in it. A little bit of yeast, right, can leaven the whole loaf of bread. A pinch of salt, right, can season a whole lot of soup. Same is true in societies. Robert Bellah, a University of California sociologist, for instance, in an interview with Psychology Today, said this. He said, we should never underestimate the significance of a small group of people who have a new vision of a just and a gentle world. Never underestimate that, he says. The whole quality of a culture may be changed when as few as 2% of its population has a new vision. Only 2% can change an entire culture. Think about that. I mean, Christians are way more than 2% of American culture. We can make an incredible difference in the world. We can preserve and we can add flavor to our world if we put our hearts and we put our hands together. Not so much because of what we do, but because of who God made us to be. We are God's beloved children, fully equipped to preserve, to spice up, to liven up the world. In a little bit, we're going to sing a song. I think we do that right here in church. But I'm going to give you, the ushers are going to give you a little reminder of this truth for you today. As we're singing, the ushers are going to pass out little salt packets. Okay? And each of you gets one little salt packet. Okay? Now, don't put it on your French fries when you go, to Arby's this afternoon. Okay? I want you to keep that salt packet with you at least for this week. Put it in your purse, stick it in your pocket, and I want you to pull it out every once in a while and look at that thing and go, oh yeah, I'm salt. I'm valuable. I'm loved. I'm equipped to do great things in this world. Let's pray. Gracious God, help us to keep our saltiness and make us salty. Make us lively. Fill us with your love. Fill us with your joy. Fill us with your Holy Spirit and your energy. And then, Lord, fill us so much that there's excess in our lives that just kind of bumps that flows out when we bump into other people. And help us, God, not to hide our flavorfulness, but rather to get out into the world and to make a difference wherever we are, whether that's in the supermarket line, or our businesses, or schools, in our classrooms, wherever we are. Help us to get out and to make a difference in the world. All of God's people sat together. I'm going to invite you to stand.